Welcome into the roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you. And there's a lot going on in Washington right now, if you haven't really noticed that much. And of course, things are headed towards November 17th, when the government has a date with a possible shutdown or a possible continuing resolution or a possible budget. How is this going to affect the freight universe? We got two people to talk about it here with us. Jim Lucier, the founding partner of Capital Alpha Partners, joins us, as well as Lauren Smith, the president of Skyline Policy Risk Group as well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Jim, there seems to be a lot of noise right now going on in Washington, D.C. Obviously, there's a lot of chaos. There's a new speaker. On the one hand, it looks like everything's out of control. On another hand, if you kind of look behind the scenes, maybe things are getting done that we're not necessarily privy to. I have to think that we're somewhere in the middle of that. What's your thinking on what the actual vibe is in Washington right now?
Well, the vibe in Washington is a tremendous sense of relief as of last week that there was finally a Speaker of the House. And it seemed that this new Speaker would enjoy a honeymoon period and that a government shutdown might not be inevitable, that perhaps this new guy could at least get us through the first risk of a government shutdown on November 17th, and maybe also move appropriations bills in a reasonable way. Now, I'll grant that he's only had 1 week to go, but it's not looking promising right now. From a freight perspective, he'd be very interested in the transportation HUD appropriations bill, and that was supposed to have been done yesterday, and it's not moving now. It might move next week. Also, I think we're heading back toward the government shutdown again. I don't think that there's any plan by this new speaker to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open. Instead of a clean CR, just what we normally think of as extending the government, there's some sort of laddered CR plan out there. And if you wonder what that means, join the club. I'm not sure what it means either, except that they're doing a kind of they're doing custom CRs for every appropriations bill with different funding levels, apparently. So I'm afraid that the sense of optimism that we'd gotten through a period of chaos, the sense that there'd be a honeymoon, that this guy would get a free pass for a while, seems not to be the case, because the House and Senate are going to be in confrontation over a CR. Haven't even mentioned aid to Israel yet, and of course aid to Ukraine.
Obviously, lots of stuff going on in Washington at the moment right now. Lauren, what in your mind is the biggest concern in terms of going forward again? November 17th, only 2 weeks away.
I think it is the case that there's a little bit of a honeymoon for the new speaker, but I think that I think Jim's right. I think it's going to be chaotic as we get towards the end of the year. And I also think that an increasing amount of focus is going to be on the 1% cut that was negotiated in the debt ceiling deal over the summer. I think as we get past the new year, I think there's going to be more of a focus on that. And that, I think, could create additional chaos.
Jim, how nebulous is this situation right now, and the fact that maybe under normal circumstances, even behind the scenes, you kind of have an idea of what's going to happen here eventually? I don't get the sense that we have that here at this point. How nebulous is the situation as you see it, in terms of, is there anything that we have a decent idea of what we know is going to happen?
Well, I think the long-term outlook is clear, and it's really been clear all along, which is that we're going to enter this period of the 1% sequester that Lauren was talking about as a fail-safe alternative to a long-term government shutdown. What they agreed to in the debt limit bill was an arrangement that said that if you can't pass all the appropriations bills you need to pass, we will extend everything, but with a 1% haircut. And a lot of people worry that that 1% haircut could become permanent, and that's a problem. And so from the freight world, you would need to worry about how much transportation funding comes from current year bills and how much transportation funding comes from multi-year appropriations that have already been cleared. But I think that at least in some areas, you're going to have to worry about cuts to the expected level of funding, because you're not going to get new appropriations. You're going to get this long-term CR arrangement. we've seen this coming, and the question was, could we possibly avoid it? Could we also avoid a near-term shutdown? And I think that this long-term view of budget cuts impacting transportation is probably where we're going.
Lauren, just to dovetail right off of that, obviously the transportation bill is being talked about right now, still not passed yet. But what is your biggest concern if you're in the freight industry in terms of what Congress needs to do to appease and give peace of mind to those in the freight industry?
Well, I'd be concerned about anything that could interrupt the letting of contracts in particular, or funding out of the non-federal highway administration programs, put it that way. So you've got your federal aid highway programs that come through the Federal Highway Administration, and those are funded by the gas tax at the federal level. And the good news is that a government shutdown won't affect that. However, some of the other programs, such as the discretionary programs, the raise grants, the infra grants, the rural grants, a lot of the truck parking projects could end up being delayed if the grant schedule for USDOT gets pushed back. And so if you're thinking bigger picture about truck infrastructure over the next several years, or rail infrastructure programs, you could see a delay as the entire schedule for grant making gets pushed back potentially a few months, potentially 6 months or more, depending on how disruptive the appropriation cycle ends up being.
Jim, as you look at, obviously we've already talked a little bit about the differences that we're going to see with the House and the Senate in terms of moving bills forward, and especially talking about the CR, as you mentioned. Of course, the House had a lot of difficulty, to put it mildly, about getting a new speaker. And of course, the fragmented GOP presented its own problems through that process. Do you think that will still play a part in how these appropriations bills will play out in terms of, will a fragmented GOP, can they pass bills and not be held hostage by one group or another trying to move things through Congress?
Well, I'm afraid it's not looking good right now. Going back to the long-term scenario I was talking about, it's always looked as if the House would get rolled, as we say, by the Senate, that the House would more or less be forced to take a Senate-passed bill or to into a long-term CR if they don't. And, the early optimism that maybe the House can stick together and actually negotiate a strong position, a reasonable position, may have been misplaced. So I think that we may see government shutdowns followed by endless wrangling over Senate-passed bills. And I'm not sure the House is going to be able to pass its own bills, frankly.
So at the moment here, Lauren, again, looking at kind of what's difficult here coming up, again, the 17th, not too far away. A CR is obviously not a great option, or at least not one that has a great possibility in terms of how much negotiation has to be done here. How much concern do you have in the very near future versus later on, perhaps, again, a year or so, or not a year, but maybe 6 months from now, hopefully when all these appropriations bills are finally done and things can hopefully get back to a reasonable sense of normal?
Well, yeah, and that's a key point. I actually I'm somewhat optimistic that we'll get past the November 17th deadline without a shutdown, because there does seem to be still a little bit of some goodwill among the Republican conference for the speaker that could allow for another continuing resolution, even though you have a lot of congressmen that have said no more continuing resolutions. We settle it or we don't settle it. But I think that there's a good chance that we will see a continuing resolution ahead of November 17th. Where I think it does get, very difficult is after the end of the year, when members of Congress really start to zero in on whether or not there's going to be a cut. And it does take until about April for that 1% cut to actually be locked in for the year. So you could see the first quarter of next year that could end up being really chaotic.
We've got about 30 seconds left here, Jim. What is the one aspect that's in the entire area that gives you the most concern in terms of a new speaker, the relationship between House Republicans, the relationship between the House and the Senate? What concerns you the most?
Well, I think we're focused on problems with the House Republicans, but the Senate Republicans aren't exactly united either. We can see some fragmentation there. And I also think that the White House doesn't read the situation well, and that some of their requests for aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, and no policy changes on immigration, no policy changes in border security are just unrealistic and frankly inflammatory in the current situation.
Yeah.
They're making.
I'm running out of time here. I'm sorry. Lauren, what do you think is the variable that has to be watched the most?
I think it's going to be Ukraine and Israel aid.
All right, we'll have to see how things pan out. It's going to be exciting next 2 months because we get to the end of the year. Lauren Smith and Jim Lucier, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, let's move over to our last check of headlines with Kaylee.